I think by now you know that it's sort of our 150th birthday, so 25 if you're a dog. And some people have raised the question, like why 150? What's so special about 150? Why not 133 or 167? But anyway, there we go. The parks have been free all year. I'm not sure I've noticed a whole lot else. But in 1867, various groups got together and created this federated land. Just the little coloured bits there. Ironically, the conference or the meetings were held in Prince Edward Island, so they hosted it, but then they decided they wouldn't join yet. They'd wait and see how it goes. Number of consequences for cartography. Martin mentioned the newly acquired lands from the Hudson Bay, so that this prompted more mapping, the promise of a national railway across from coast to coast, and then the activities, both south of the border and north of the border. The purchase of Alaska was in the same year, 1867, and there's renewed expansion and mapping in the US because of the end of the Civil War. I thought I'd just do a quick diversion. Probably most of you are aware of this now. So ironically, one of the first international visitors to the new country was Jefferson Davis, who is the deposed Confederate president. And he'd put his family in Montreal for the duration of the Civil War for safety. And then he joined them once he was released from Union prison in 1867, not long before, or just a few weeks before Confederation took place. So I don't think any of us would have remembered this, except that the papers had this little story about this plaque downtown just along St. Catherine, which was removed, and it's quite funny if you Google it, if you look online, and you can see these two guys pulling it off, and you can't tell whether it's being done officially by Hudson Bay or just a couple of guys who walked by and said, hey, we'll take that plaque. And so now you can see the empty space where the plaque used to be. Anyway, so back to the story, and as well as the political changes which caused promoted mapping, of course this was the time when both photolithography and offset printing got going around 1870, 1875. So this finally removed the need to produce mirror image printing plates and enabled both full colored layered maps and continuous and halftone printing. So when I'm trying to look at when did it really happen, my Bible source is Swiss Topo, and if you use their map viewer and go through from the start, all through most of the 19th century, you see the black and white Dufour hashering, and then the Siegfried shading and full layer maps. Those are the first two map areas that pop up in 1870. So the Swiss don't lie. So right up to this point then, when you look at the maps of Canada and probably of the States as well, up till about that time they're essentially monochrome. I suppose now we might call them, all vectors. And wherever there's color, it's essentially added by hand. And in contrast, so there's a railway map. In contrast, a decade or so later, a full color map with at least the apparition of hill shading. So 1885 corresponds to when the Transcontinental Railway was completed. And a lot of the impetus as well was to transport Martin talked about the industrialized Europe, and so to bring across the Europeans, especially those who were interested in climbing in the Rockies and the Selkirks. The first map series was a couple of years later, centered around Banff, again essentially looking at drawing in the European crowds into the mountains of the Rockies and the Selkirks. And following on from Joe's talk, you can see at the bottom there, as well as the Oakle project. I think this map series was outside that, but the folks at McMaster have made the entire series available and fully downloadable. And there's nothing not to like about this map series. Every aspect of the design is just close to perfection. The balance between the contours and the manual hill shading, I love the trees with, you know, the little green trees, because especially in mountain areas, we know that, you know, a green polygon blob doesn't do it. I mean, trees aren't like that in the mountain areas. And the quote at the bottom from Siebert and Nicholson's The Maps of Canada, the skillful hill shading complements the contouring for a 3D illusion. The glaciers with blue form lines look cold and imposing. Does the sound okay? I'm not standing very close to the speaker. You got me? Okay. So all these maps in the late 19th century are using this technique of phototopography, which was introduced to Canada by Edward Deville, who emigrated from France, and he became the Surveyor General in Canada. And it's kind of interesting that it was widely adapted in Canada, as it was also used in the US, but really not in Europe. And so the basic advantage was that the surveyors could spend less time in the mountains with a short summer season, take lots of oblique photos, and then work on the photogrammetry and the geometry back in the lab during winter. So it allowed for much quicker coverage of a large area by a small number of people. And I think on that last map, you can see some labels every now and then, and those were the photo stations where they were. In the bottom left map you can see part of the US-Canada border mapping, which again was spurred on after 1867, and not just Galacta, BC, but all the way across the 49th parallel to, and eventually to Maine. Another one of these maps, beautiful design. You see the loopy little railway at the top center, so you may just be able to see the place called Glacier. So this was a major destination for Europeans to come, get off the train, and then climb the peaks. It got superseded later by the Trans-Canada Highway. The first major map series was the inch to 3 mile sectional maps, and so this basically followed on from Martin's talk in the first talk. And again, the University of Calgary map librarians have made this nice index map and draped it on top of Google Earth so that you can get a better idea of the coverage. You can see that it essentially covers pretty much all of the prairies, with a few map sheets going into the Rocky Mountains, and then a couple just going across into Vancouver. So this essentially was a map series that enabled the settlement of the prairies, and here's a sample edition again. When you look at the design, it would be hard to improve on that. They carried on with the series through much of the 20th century, but stopped producing new sheets after 1922, and this was because when the National Topographic Series was developed in 1925, they decided to go arithmetically inch to the mile, inch to 2 mile, inch to 4 mile, essentially eliminating the previously very popular 3 mile series. So this is showing one of the first maps, 1915. The first ones were 1906. I think Joe said that. But there weren't that many produced due to the two wars and a depression in between. So it really took off after 1950. The return of both veterans and planes meant there was lots of resources to do mapping using aerial photography, and that pretty much spelled the end of the phototopography period. We went from the imperial scales to the metric scales, bringing in UTM as well. And there's also a lot of activity on an intermediate scale, the 1 to 125,000, which lasted for quite a bit, for most of the 20th century, at least in British Columbia and Quebec, where it was seen as a good compromise scale both for forestry and tourism. And I talked about it quite a bit. I really like this map scale. I think it's the right level of detail that performs a lot of things. It was also my cartographer's story is that this was the map that kept me in Canada and saved me from going back to Margaret Thatcher's Britain. Because I examined some of the maps in this series for my master's thesis under Henry Kastner, basically looking at the role of hill shading and how it did much more than just provide a 2.5D picture, but it gave you a framework for examining and organizing the rest of the map content. So you'll notice on this one the northeast-southwest lineation of a lot of the contours, and fortunately some of these map sheets had hill-shaded versions, so you can see very clearly here the glacial history of especially the east half of the map sheet. And if you look at some of those drumlin features, you can see that in some cases a contour is there to show that you'd see it on a contour map, whoops. But in other cases, it's providing a lot more detail than is available on the contour map, because the skilled hill shaders are able to sketch in a lot of detail, although at the cost of time. If you look in the top left, some of them were still around when I came to Canada, and they estimated it took about 100 hours to create 1 square foot of hill shading. At least well done. And another example from Fredericton and Charlottetown, where the Confederation Conference was held. In this particular case, I couldn't get hold of the shaded relief version, although I knew it existed, but I could go and download the federal data and create it from contours. And so what took those experts 100 hours per square foot took me about 15 minutes, although that's no comment on me being any more skilled than they were. And you may be able to see on this the highest points in the top left. And so there is actually downhill skiing in Prince Edward Island. People in the prairies would probably say that hill is huge, huge. So by the time I finished my master's, a good chunk of the provinces were mapped at 1 to 50,000, not complete, and they were complete up to the so-called wilderness line. And I've just drawn in a star there. My current location in Prince George is, you can see, it's a little dip in the wilderness line, which is where the city is, and it's essentially the northernmost city in Canada that has more than 30,000 people in it. And so sometimes we'd probably say the city is really wilderness as well. And through the 70s, as well as the standard federal maps, there was that whole impetus to keep mapping the Rockies for tourists and climbers. So you get some appealing maps with, in this case, a somewhat unusual purple for the glaciers, which still maintains that sort of the cool look. And at the same time, in the 60s and 70s, a lot of special glacier maps based on funding from the International Hydrological Decade, and we actually imported 2 Swedish hill shaders to show us, not me, but to show the guys just before me how to use the Swiss method and to produce some Swiss-style maps. And the high point was probably this one, probably the finest Canadian mountain map produced that I've seen by the Swiss method. So finally in 2012, the 1 to 50,000 map series was completed. That's it on the left. It's mostly blue, mostly ice up in one of the Arctic islands. And the extent of our challenge in mapping Canada is perhaps shown by this map on the right that did the rounds in the last year. Can you see that red line? So the red line is 46 degrees north at the bottom, and essentially 50% of Canadians live below that line and 50% live above it. So, you know, that whole area above is mostly vacant. Put another way, 90% of Canadians live further south than the whole of the British Isles. So it's a northern land, but the people, it looks even more impressive when you have this map on the Webb Mercator projection, because it makes all the islands much bigger. So the attempt to map the urban areas kind of shows that same distribution. All the map sheets, which Joe showed some of them, they're mostly in southern Ontario with a few spread across the country, and that whole thing was ended in the 70s. But then all the digital maneuvers since then have essentially superseded it. So we've got very high scale municipal mapping, and I particularly like this example from our city, the university, just in the left center there. But you can see these wavy lines all the way down here, And so these mark the beach or the shoreline of glacial Lake Prince George when the ice melted and ponded up. And we'd have a lakefront right at the university if it was still like that, although it might be a bit cool. So what happened basically once the feds finished mapping most of the provinces is they switched from map production to providing data. So this is one company that has taken those data, and generated special products at a range of scales. Well, I remember when I first met them, they were starting in Quebec and they were going to spread and do the whole country, but they've satisfied themselves with most of southern Ontario and southern Quebec. But I think this representation is probably one of the finest non-mountain relief rendering I've seen. On the western side, one of the first companies to take up the challenge was Gemtrack, and they had this rather distinctive, they chose a southwest illumination source on the premise that most people are hiking in the afternoon and they got that warm sun from the southwest. So whether or not it works, I'm not a particular fan of that Sahara orange for the alpine, but yeah, maybe that too gives a nice warm feeling. And then a couple of others. So one of my own ex-students, who's now the GIS guy for Jasper Town and Park, has produced a series of maps at a range of scales using that federal data that's provided now for free for popular hiking trips. And Jeff Clark's done the same thing. I don't know if Jeff's in here. You can see his map in the gallery upstairs. So he's basically filling the gap left by the feds, no longer active in map production. I'm not doing too bad. I thought I should finish off with two things you should really see while you're here, and portraying Montreal's favourite sons. Of course, Leonard Cohen, who we sometimes call a national poet, passed away last year. And I don't know if you saw it when you went to Brutopia, but if you went up a couple of blocks, you could look back and see it on the side of the building. And you can also see it where I've drawn the arrow if you go up to the chalet, Mont-Royal Chalet, which you really have to do, a 20-minute walk, very easy. And you can, with the evening sun, you can see it shining on Leonard's face there in his I'm your man pose. And then, of course, for local heroes, none's bigger than William Shatner. Born and raised in Montreal, got his bachelor's at McGill, year I was born. Oh, I just told you how old I was. And his doctorate 6 years ago. And after he got his doctorate, they unofficially renamed the university centre. So that's another thing. If you just take a little walk, go up Rue McTavish, it's a lovely, after 40 years in Canada, that's the first time I've seen it. A lovely walk, and you can go in the main centre there. You don't have to be Star Trek geeky like me. I couldn't even do it. I was trying to do the Spock thing. But yeah, you can even do it in the break between the end of the session and the banquet. I think the guy I handed my camera to had a few drinks, and I think he bopped me in the eye with the camera when he gave it back to me. So, anyway, yeah, so boldly go.